Welcome to Stories and Tea with Mrs. Straka, Episode 2. All right, picking back up in Chapter 3. Here we go. The next week seemed awfully long. The only time I really hated school was during springtime, particularly in May, when the birds were busy nesting on the prairies. This May week, what with thinking about owls and sitting by the open window sniffing the smells of springtime, I wished that school had never been invented. Every recess and after school, Murray and Bruce and I talked about the young owls and tried to think of ways to get them out of their nest. Murray suggested we should cut down the tree, but that was too dangerous because the young owls might be hurt. Bruce said he might get his father to come and shoot the old owls so it would be safe for us to climb the tree, but that didn't seem fair. The only thing I could think of was firecrackers. My idea was to get some small skyrockets and let them off under the nest to scare the mother owl away. The trouble was we had no money, and anyway, storekeepers wouldn't sell skyrockets to kids our age. Then, on Friday night, we had a storm of a kind called Chinook. Chinooks come down out of the Rocky Mountains in Alberta, and sometimes they blow right across Saskatchewan, and they blow like fury. Lying in my bed on Friday night, I could hear branches snapping off of poplar trees along the riverbank. The rain was pelting on the roof so hard that it scared Mutt, who always slept on my bed, and made him howl. I had to pull a quilt over his head to make him keep quiet. He hated storms. I worried about the young owls for a long time before I finally fell asleep. Early on Saturday morning, Murray called for me, and we met Bruce at the railroad bridge. It was a fine morning, and the sun kept popping in and out between white clouds that were racing across the sky, trying to catch up with the Chinook. Everything was steaming from all the rain, and the prairie was soggy wet. We hurried across the fields and didn't care if our feet did get soaked, because we were worried about the owls. When we were still quite away from the owl bluff, Bruce gave a shout. "Looky!" he yelled. "Old Miller's blind is gone!" Sure enough, 6 or 7 of the biggest cottonwoods were snapped right off at the tops, and as for Mr. Miller's blind, it had been blown clean out of its tree, and nobody ever did find it again. But the worst thing was the owl's nest. The rain and wind had smashed it to pieces, and all that was left was a stick or two stuck in the crotch where the nest had been. There was no sign of the old owl at all, but on the ground near the foot of the tree were 2 young owls, and they were cold and dead. They were so young they had grown only about half their feathers, and the baby down was still sticking to them all over. I don't know whether they were killed by the fall or not, but they were wet as sponges, and I think they probably died from being so wet and cold all night long. We felt as miserable as could be, and all we could think of to do was to have a funeral for the little owls. Bruce had his jackknife with him, and he started to dig a grave while Murray and I went looking for the right kind of sticks to use for crosses. There was a big pile of brush nearby, and I happened to give it a kick in passing. Something went snap, snap, snap from under it. I shoved my hand under the brush and touched a bundle of wet feathers. Bruce and Murray came over, and we pulled the brush away, and there was the missing owlet, the 3rd one that had been in the nest, and he was still alive. He was bigger than the other 2, and that was probably because he was the first one hatched. Horned owls are funny that way. They begin to lay their eggs in March when it's still winter on the prairie. The eggs are laid a few days apart, but from the time the first one is laid, the mother has to start setting. If she waited until she had a full clutch of eggs, the early ones would be chilled and would never hatch. The first egg that's laid hatches first, and that young owl gets a 4 or 5 day head start on the next one, who in turn gets a head start on the next one. The one we found must have been the first to hatch, because he was not only bigger than the others, but must have been a lot stronger too. When the nest blew apart, he fell to the ground. He was able to wiggle under the pile of brush for shelter, and that probably saved his life. He was about as big as a chicken, and you could see his grown-up feathers pushing through the baby down. He even had the beginnings of the 2 horn feathers growing on his head. A surprising thing about him was that he was almost pure white, with only small black markings on the ends of his feathers. When we found him, he looked completely miserable, because all of his down and feathers were stuck together in clumps, and he was shivering like a leaf. I thought he would be too miserable to feel like fighting, but when I tried to pick him up, he hunched forward, spread his wings, and hissed at me. It was a good try, but he was too weak to keep it up, and he fell right over on his face. I was still a little bit afraid of him because his claws were long and sharp, and his beak, which he kept snapping, seemed big enough to bite off my finger. But he did look so wet and sad that after a while I stopped being afraid. I got down on my knees in front of him and very slowly put my hand on his back. He hunched down as if he thought I was going to hurt him, but when I didn't hurt, he stopped hissing and he lay still. He felt as cold as ice. I took off my shirt and put it over him, and then I picked him up as carefully as I could and carried him out of the bluff so he could sit in the sunshine and get dry and warm again. It was surprising how fast he started to get better. In half an hour, his feathers were dry, and he was standing up looking around him. Murray had brought along some roast beef sandwiches for lunch, and he took some meat out of the sandwiches and held it out to the owl. The owl looked at him a minute with his head on one side, then it gave a funny little hop and came close enough to snatch the meat from one of Murray's fingers. It gave a couple gulps, blinked its eyes once, and the meat was gone. He was certainly a hungry owl. He ate all the meat we had, and most of the bread as well. When I found some dead mice that his mother must have left on the edge of the nest, which had also been blown to the ground, he ate them too. They must have been hard to swallow, because he ate them whole. But he got them down somehow. After that, we were friends. When Bruce and I started to walk away from him just to see what he would do, the owl followed right along behind us like a dog. He couldn't fly, of course, and he couldn't walk any too well either. He kind of jumped along, but he stayed right with us all the same. I think he knew he was an orphan, and that if he stayed with us, we'd look after him. When I sat down again, he came up beside me, and after taking a sideways look into my face, he hopped up on my leg. I was afraid his claws would go right through my skin, but they didn't hurt at all. He was being very careful. "Guess he's your owl, all right," Bruce said, and I could see that he was a little bit jealous. "No, sir, Bruce," I replied. "He can live at my place, but he's going to be our owl. All three of us." We left him sitting in the sun by the haversacks, and then we buried the other two little owls and had a funeral for them. After that, we were ready to go home. We decided the best way to carry our new pet was to put it in my backpack. He didn't like it much, but after a struggle, we managed to stuff him into it. We left his head sticking out so he could see where he was going. Mutt and Bruce's dog Rex hadn't been with us that morning. I think the two of them had gone off cat hunting before we got up. But as we were walking along the sidewalk in front of my house, we met old Mutt coming down from wherever he had been. Mutt was cross-eyed and short-sighted, and so he could never see anything too well. He came up to me to say hello, wagging his long tail and sniffing at me, and then suddenly he smelled owl. I don't think he knew exactly what it was he smelled, because he had never been close to an owl before, but he knew he smelled something strange. I stood there, trying not to laugh while he sniffed all around me. He stuffed my trousers, and when he began to sniff the haversack, his nose was nearly in the owl's face. The bird opened its beak and snapped it shut again, right on the end of poor old Mutt's black nose. Mutt gave a yelp you could have heard a mile away and went loping off to hide his hurt feelings underneath the garage. We put the owl in the summer house, and when Dad got home from work, the owl was sitting on the orange crate watching gophers running around on the floor below him. It kept him busy. His head kept turning one way and then the other until it looked as if he were going to unscrew it right off his shoulders. He didn't know what to make of the gophers because he had never seen a live one before, but he was certainly interested in them. "Better count your gophers, Billy," said my father. "I have an idea they might start disappearing. By the way, what do you call your owl?" I hadn't thought of any name for him up until that moment, but now one just popped into my head. I remembered Christopher Robin's owl in Winnie the Pooh. "His name is Wool," I said, and Wool he was forever after. One more sip, and then we'll start chapter 4. All right. I woke up early on Sunday morning while everyone else in the house was still asleep. I sneaked downstairs in my pajamas and went out into the backyard to see how Wool was getting along. The grass was still wet with dew, and it was cold and slippery under my bare feet. I peeked through the screen of the summer house, but for a while I couldn't see Wool. He had got down off his orange crate and was standing in the shadows on the floor. There wasn't a single gopher in sight. And I had an awful moment as I wondered if he had eaten the lot of them. Then I realized this was silly, for there had been 30 gophers, and he was only one small owl. Wool didn't see me, but he did seem fascinated by a pile of old sacks lying in a corner, and as I watched, he made a hop and a skip and jumped on top of the sacks. Then we both found out where the gophers were. I never saw so many gophers move so fast. They came shooting out from under the sacks like bullets, and they went crazily bouncing from side to side of the summer house, looking for some new place to hide from him. I guessed what had happened. Wool must have been feeling lonely, and so he decided to make friends with the gophers. But if Wool didn't know anything about the gophers knew all about owls. And when he plopped down among them, they must have run for shelter under those sacks as if the devil himself were after them. Now that Wool had accidentally, or was it on purpose, chased them into the open again, they went mad. One big fellow came zooming against the wall, bounced off it, and ran headlong into Wool. Wool jumped, fluffed his feathers, and gave a surprised little hoot. The gopher probably thought that his last moment had come, but he wasn't gonna die like a coward, so he bit Wool on the leg. Wool exploded. 1 minute he was on the floor, and the next he was clinging upside down to the screening at the top of the summer house. He was scared to death. I don't think anything in the world could have persuaded him to go back down there among those bouncing, biting gophers. I went into the summer house and untangled Wool from the screening and took him outside. He was so glad to see me that he started to hoot and couldn't seem to stop. It was almost like hiccups. I couldn't put him back with the gophers, so I tucked him under my arm and tiptoed back into the house and upstairs to my room. My bedroom was on the 3rd floor, right up under the roof. Nobody ever came up there except me and the maid, whose name was Ophelia. We always called her Ophi, who made my bed and tried to dust the room. I knew perfectly well Mother would never allow me to keep Wool in the house, but I was pretty sure that if I could just keep him locked away in my room and hide him under the bed when Ophi was due, nobody would know. When I went downstairs for breakfast about an hour later, I left Wool sitting on the back of a chair, acting quite at home. I thought I closed the bedroom door tight, but the latch must have slipped. Dad and I had breakfast together, but Mother wasn't feeling well that day, so she decided to have hers in bed. After Ophi brought me my porridge, she went into the kitchen and got a breakfast tray ready for Mother. Ophi was an odd sort of girl. She used to have queer dreams, and she claimed to see angels and things. Sometimes she saw them when she was supposed to be wide awake, but she was a good cook, so Dad and Mother never bothered much about the things she claimed she saw. Ophi took the breakfast tray and started up the back stairs. These stairs were dark and spooky because there was no window opening on them. About halfway up the stairs, she met Wool on his way down. Ophi gave a terrible yell and dropped the tray. Wool, who was still nervous after the trouble he had with the gophers, let out a hoot and tried to fly. He and Ophi arrived at the bottom of the stairs together, all in one flapping lump. After my father got her quieted down, Ophi went straight to her room and packed her bags. She marched out of the house without even saying goodbye to Wool and me, and none of us ever saw her again. Dad was unhappy. After breakfast, he called me into his study for a talk. "Billy," he said, "if that owl ever comes in this house again, he goes into the roasting pan. And as for you, you'll get a licking you'll remember for a week." But my father never stayed mad long. The very same afternoon, he got out his carpenter's tools, and he and I worked until after supper time making a special cage for Wool. It was a big cage, about 10 feet square, and covered all over with chicken wire. It was built around the stump of a dead tree which stood in the backyard, and on the side of the tree, Dad nailed a wooden box as a place where Wool could go to keep dry if it rained. Wool liked the new cage all right. The only trouble was that he got lonely when he was left in it. As long as Murray or Bruce or I were with him, he was perfectly happy, but when there was nobody around, he would sit on the tree stump all hunched up, looking miserable. I tried putting some pigeons in to keep him company, but they were scared of him, and he was nervous about them, so that didn't work. About 2 weeks later, the problem solved itself. It was a Tuesday, and I was biking home from school along the alley behind our block. As I came along, I saw a couple kids standing beside an oil drum and dropping stones into it. One of the kids was Georgie Barnes, but the other was a big kid that I didn't know. Georgie saw me coming and gave a yell. "Hi, Billy! Come over here and have some fun!" What those two kids were doing wasn't fun at all. In the bottom of the barrel was a baby owl, and for a minute I thought it was Wool, until I saw it was smaller and a lot darker in color. It was the dirtiest bird I ever saw. Its feathers were all ruffled and broken, and it was smeared with oil. The kids were dropping stones on it, and every time a stone hit it, it would scrunch down and make a weepy noise, like a tin whistle with a tremble in it. I wanted to tell them to stop dropping stones, but I knew that would mean a fight, and I couldn't beat the both of them. "Where'd you get it?" I asked the big kid. "What's it to you, shorty?" "Well," I said, "I have a kind of zoo at my place, and I could sure use an owl." "What you gimme for him?" "I'll give you my Boy Scout knife." "Let's have a look." I showed it to him. He opened all the blades, and then he said, "It ain't much good, but this here owl ain't much good either. Pretty near dead. Okay, kid, it's yours." Funny how some kids are. 1 minute Georgie Barnes was trying to kill the little owl with stones, but the moment I bought it, he began to act as if he wanted to be its nurse. He climbed into the barrel and handed it out to me. Then he followed me home and helped me clean some of the oil off it with a rag. He told me the big kid had found the owl's nest in a bluff near Sutherland and had shot the old owl and all but one of the young ones with his .22 rifle. He had only brought the last one home as a sort of joke that he was going to play on his dog. It was a pretty sick little owl. I guess it hadn't eaten anything for a long time, and the stones and oil hadn't done it much good either. It was too sick to sit on a branch of the tree in Wool's cage, so I put it on the floor of the cage while I went into the house to get some hamburger for it. When I got back, the new owl was lying on its side, and Wool was standing over it. I thought he must have taken a whack at it, but Georgie said no, that wasn't what happened. Georgie said the new owl had just fallen over by itself, and when Georgie tried to pick it up again, Wool jumped down out of the tree and wouldn't let Georgie near it. When I went into the cage and held some meat out towards the new owl, Wool hunched down, spread his wings, and hissed at me, as if he were saying, "You leave that bird alone or you'll have me to deal with." "Easy there," I told him. "Take it easy, Wool. This little fellow's hungry. I'm just going to feed him." I don't know if Wool understood me, but he stopped hissing anyway. I held some bits of hamburger against the new owl's beak, and after a while he took a piece. Finally, he ate the whole lot. Then he staggered to his feet and stood there, swaying back and forth. Before I could touch him, Wool sidled over until the new owl was leaning right against him. Then the new bird closed his eyes and seemed to go to sleep. That's the way we left him. By the next morning, the new owl was up on the branch with Wool, and from that time on, Wool was never lonely. When Dad got home from the office that evening, I told him all about it. I told him the new one was called Weeps, because of the weepy whistle sound he made all the time. "2 owls," my father cried, and banged his hand against his forehead. "Now we'll never get another maid. All right, Billy, but no more owls, you understand?" He needn't have worried. 2 owls was all that I wanted anyway. All right, and that's where we stop for today.